Following first, Uwe Bosma will be sharing a short introduction to the Commodity Frontiers Initiative and the development of its research agenda. And then the panel of invited speakers will share their contributions, followed by a reply from some of the network coordinators. And we will then go over to a Q&A, and we will try to get through as many questions as time allows. We finish by 6 p.m. Central European time. And in the meantime, whenever a question or comment comes up, just type away in the chat.
Thank you, Hanne. Just a few words about the origin of this research agenda. This article has been published in the Journal of Global History, did just this month, and accompanied by comments by Maxime Berg, Ruth Boston, and Ronald Flinty and Kevin O'Rourke. This agenda emerged over the past 4 or 5 years in a couple of workshops, and particularly during a stint of Mindy, Eric, and Sven and me at the Netherlands Institute of Advanced Studies. It was in the fall of 2018. At that time, we wrote most of this research agenda, inspired, of course, by the word commodity frontier by Jason Moore's concept of commodity frontiers. But what we emphatically and particularly wanted to do is to historicize the concept over the past 600 years. So we also talk about periodization, which is typically what historians tend to do, but also try to speak about how history can speak and can talk to issues that are so topical today. So what we claim is that studying the global history of capitalism through the lens of these commodity frontiers and using commodity regimes, and that's something which we'll talk about more today, I'm sure, as an analytical framework is crucial to understand capitalism itself, its origins, and thus, of course, the modern world, how it has emerged over the past 500 and 600 years. So I would basically leave it here. So this is something which has emerged over the past few years. It has been developed by the 4 of us, but in interaction with many of our colleagues. And now it has now led to this network, and many of the ideas and the ideas can also be found in the Commodity Frontiers journal, which is published twice a year, about which you might already have heard. Okay, let me leave it here.
Great, thank you, Uwe. So today we will first be hearing the contributions of our 3 invited speakers. We're very glad and really honored to have 3 distinguished experts on all topics that relate to commodity frontiers here today. Today we're joined by Nancy Peluso, Neil Brenner, and Phil McMichael, and they will share their views on the proposed research agenda, with a brief, followed by a brief reply by the authors of the research agenda, the coordinators of the network. And as indicated before, after that, we'll have time, plenty of time to further discuss these ideas with all of you joining today. So let me first introduce each of our speakers in the panel. And then I'll pass the word to each of them to share their views, their contributions. Neil Brenner is Lucy Flower Professor of Urban Sociology at the University of Chicago. He introduces himself on his webpage as a critical urban theory sociologist and geographer who's interested in all aspects of research on cities and urbanization within the social sciences, the environmental humanities, the design disciplines, and environmental studies. Among his main publications are New Urban Spaces, Urban Theory, and the Scale Question, Critique of Urbanization Selected Essays, and New State Spaces, Urban Governance, and the Rescaling of Statehood. We have also here today Phil McMichael, who is a Professor Emeritus of Global Development at Cornell University. His research focuses on questions of development and social change and the agri-food structuring and restructuring of the modern world from international political economy and political ecology perspectives. Among his most popular publications are Development and Social Change, A Global Perspective, in its 7th edition now, Food Regimes and Agrarian Questions, and Settlers and the Agrarian Question. And Nancy Peluso is an American rural sociologist, and she is the Henry J. Volks Distinguished Professor of Forest Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. And her main research focus is on forest politics and agrarian change in Southeast Asia. She conducted extensive field research in Indonesia, and among her many publications are Rich Forests, Poor People, Resource Control and Resistance in Java, Borneo in Transition, People, Forests, Conservation and Development, and Violent Environments, which was co-authored with Michael Watts. So I would like to now pass the floor to Neil Brenner to share his comments.
Thank you so much, Hanne. Thank you, Sven, Ulba, Mindy, and Eric for the very kind invitation to contribute. I'm a student of your writings over the years, both collectively now and also individually. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to dialogue with you directly. And I'm really thrilled to be on a panel with Phil and Nancy. What an incredible honor, and I look forward to the conversation. I want to offer some critical reflections from a distinct, but I would argue closely allied point of view within radical sociospatial and environmental theory, the study of capitalist urbanization. Let me also mention before going any further that the remarks I'm about to offer are grounded on collaborative work that I've been undertaking in the last couple of years with Salma Abul Hussein, William Conroy, and Swarnab Ghosh. I think Will and Swarnab are here in the room. They're brilliant PhD students at Harvard Graduate School of Design, where I used to teach. And they're also working closely with Sven Beckert in the history department at Harvard. We have a couple papers in the works on themes that are closely articulated to the Commodity Frontiers paper. And so we've been studying and discussing your work very intensively in the last couple of months and longer in terms of the broader literatures that everyone here is embedded in. So I completely appreciate and agree with the emphasis on primary commodity production, what the authors term commodity frontiers as an absolutely essential dimension of the global political ecologies, contradictions, crisis tendencies of capitalism. The main questions I want to pose concern how to theorize that dimension, especially in relation to what we in our little research group think of as the combined and uneven historical geographies, metabolic dynamics, and contradictions of this particular system. My own particular starting point for engaging with this literature, I want to say something about because it might be a little bit unexpected, and I think it could be relevant to the broader discussion, and that is namely what I think of as the blind spots and really the fetishisms of urban social science, including radical urban theory, so not only more mainstream traditions. So I've based my scholarship for much of my academic career within this field. I have an increasingly antagonistic relationship to urban studies. My work involves a fairly systematic critique of the field's underlying epistemic foundations. And to the degree that fellow urbanists engage these days with what I have to say, I have the sense that I'm increasingly viewed as a renegade scholar, as someone whose work lies in a certain way beyond the pale, beyond the terrain or parameters of what they consider to be meaningful urban research. But still I persist. I persist in my critique. In other words, I'm not simply going to leave urban studies behind and do primary commodity production or other fields that I'm deeply immersed in. We need urban theory. We need urbanization, I want to argue, because I don't really enjoy being the target of polemic, but I am convinced, and I want to share some of these perspectives today, that urbanization as a concept is relevant to the study of the world ecologies of capitalism, and that urbanization substantively is a fundamental dynamic. It's not the only one, but it's fundamental to historical contemporary capitalism, its metabolisms in the plural, its contradictions. But indeed that we have to reconceptualize and radically expand and historicize. I fully agree with the imperative of our authors, historicize the concept of urbanization. Yeah. One of the main problems of theories of urbanization and concepts of urbanization is that they're universalizing and relatively ahistorical. We're getting a little background from the Secretariat. There we go, thank you so much. So, okay, so just quickly, to give further context to what I just said, 5 tendencies in urban social science, which I think are a total blockage to critical understanding, and the critiques that I'm going to offer immediately take us into the study of commodity frontiers. Number one, city centrism. The fetish of the city, understood in universal terms as the engine of capitalist industrialization, and specifically of what Jason Moore and others call capitalization. Very problematic. Secondly, and relatedly, the epistemic externalization of non-city spaces. In other words, the systematic bracketing of the manifold hidden abodes, to use a term, of course, from Marx, in which Nancy Fraser and others have recently brought in, the hidden abodes of city building, including all non-agglomerative moments of capitalist metabolism, extraction, agrarian production, significant aspects of logistics, as well as the manifold waste externalizations and metabolic rifts or rifting processes associated with capital, whether in the form of surplus populations, toxic waste, or carbon. As we know, many of these hidden abodes are indeed key terrains and frontiers of capitalization. So in our research group, we talk about capitalization with agglomeration, which is basically industrial urbanization, but we're also very interested in capitalization without agglomeration, which is basically processes of industrialization within what our authors call commodity frontiers. The point is that each of the metabolic relays associated with these non-city spaces, for me, is constitutive of city building. It's not external to it. And to the degree that we think of city building as self-propelled, we're engaged in fetishism. My urbanist colleagues do not agree, but still I persist. 2 quick examples, again, from literatures that people here are very familiar with. So Farshad Araghi, brilliant analyst of exactly these issues, he explicitly connects agrarian dispossession to waves of urban informalization across the longue durée. So this is a perfect illustration of these interdependencies. Another one that I'm really interested in is related to fossil capital. So fossil energy extractive relays and the logistics systems that move coal and oil to big cities are constitutive to what urban agglomeration theorists study. And yet they completely bracket energy regimes and their geographies. So Andreas Malm and some of his work gestures towards this, but he tends to bracket the abstract spatialities that are actually associated with coal mining and logistics, and really to focus on the city. And I think that's not sufficient. So 2 other quick blind spots of urban studies: the restriction of relational dialectical thinking, mainly to analyze intercity relations. So I'm not saying that my colleagues in the field of critical urban studies aren't dialectical. There's lots of really sophisticated dialectics at work, but it's a restricted lens, whether it's historical studies of central place theory or the field that in some ways was my own intellectual socialization, global city theory and the LA School of Industrial Agglomeration is very dialectical in certain scales. But a lot of it's looking, Saskia Sassen, brilliant analysis, the world city theory work of Peter Taylor and others, it's intercity relations. The rest of their map of the world tends to be empty. And this is completely untenable. 2 other quick conclusions that are very relevant to where my contribution to this discussion, and again, still focusing on urban studies. The fetishized universalization of the urban-rural or town-country divide. So in effect, a completely static conceptualization of combined and uneven development in which the processes in question are always reinscribed, as it were, in the same buckets, the city and the country, the urban and the rural, rather than engaging with the reconstitution of the very units of sociospatial and environmental relations through the very process. Again, this is something Phil McMichael analyzed a long time ago under the rubric of incorporated comparison. And I still, and my group, we keep going back to Phil's paper from, was it 1990? Very much in tune with this methodology of the units cannot be reified. They have to be constituted in relation to the actual analysis of sociospatial environmental process, struggle, contradiction. Urban studies, despite all the dialectics, has not really adequately taken that imperative on board. And then one other quick externalization or blind spot in this field, which I also think is relevant to this conversation, the almost total bracketing, I briefly alluded to this earlier, the almost total bracketing of the energetic foundations and consequences of city building. So agglomerations are basically assumed across, from Edward Glaser to much more critical perspectives in urban studies to be self-propelled through internal dynamics associated with particular divisions of labor and capitalization processes that occur within cities, regardless of whether they're powered by animal muscle, by human muscle, by water, by coal, by oil, or by wind or solar. And this is completely outrageous in many ways when you start to think about it, because if you bring in the energetic, as it were, exoskeleton into the power of agglomeration, it no longer looks like an exoskeleton. All the relays of energy fuel infrastructure that power agglomeration economies are contingent upon massive transformations of territory, social relations, environment. Again, very obvious, I think, to people in this group, but urban theory, urban studies externalizes it. So from this point of view, despite the many critical energies and insights, the field of urban studies has to be totally reinvented. Its very constitution as urban studies, which is really city studies, is based on epistemic closures, blind spots, and fetishisms that were untenable in the 1920s when the Chicago School formed, that were drastically problematic in the 1980s and 1990s when global city theory and the LA School and other critical traditions, including of urban Marxism, were gaining momentum. And they're completely, again, I repeat, outrageous in the context of contemporary planetary environmental emergencies. So again, my colleagues in the field might think that I'm being outrageous in saying that, but still I persist. So it's against this background with my comrades, Salma, Will, and Swarnab, that we've been diving deeper into the work of this wonderful community in order to learn and build upon and perhaps contribute to these conversations, also in relation to other battles and intellectual projects that we're pursuing. So I've already gone on probably for more than my 10 minutes. So I will, in terms of contributing to the discussion, I'm going to be just bullet point style now. And maybe in the conversation, I can, if people are interested in this, I suspect this will articulate to some points that other colleagues are going to bring in. I'm just going to flag 3 or 4 questions without elaborating them, because I did want to share those points just in terms of also thinking about the ways in which the research agenda that your group has elaborated has implications in lots of other fields, perhaps beyond even your immediate purview, because I don't know if folks in this room are really following the particular patterns of debate within urban studies. The question that I want to pose, the overarching one, is basically how might we connect the dynamics, contradictions, and crisis tendencies of capitalist urbanization to the patterns and pathways of commodity frontiers and their historical geographies as framed here. The work that we've been doing in the Urban Theory Lab, again with Salma, Swarnab, Will, and others, basically involves developing a much more expansive conception of planetary and extended urbanization that looks at urbanization as a dialectic between these moments of concentration, capitalized agglomeration, concentrated urbanization, as we call it, and the remaking of non-city space in relation to city building processes and their results. So that dialectic is basically another way into the problematique of commodity frontiers, which puts into relief a little bit more in the foreground, at least as part of the dialectic, the question of city building. But it also requires, I would suggest, a much more systematic historical spatialization of the frontiers themselves. And that's basically the point that I want to make. So here are my questions. What is, and Jason Moore, by the way, I was able to listen in to the conversation with Jason in your group back in the summertime, which was fantastic. Like, that was a really rich conversation. And a lot of what I'm going to say in a certain way is building upon some of that conversation and again, keeping Jason's work, as I think it already is, front and center in this debate. I think it's incredibly generative in terms of some of the categories and methods it offers. So first question, what is a frontier? Is it a metaphor? Is it a concept? Is it a theory? Is it all the above? And I know that's been a conversation in your group. I think we've got to keep that conversation going. I'm actually not satisfied with the concept in any of the senses, as metaphor, as concept, as theory. I think it names the problematique, primary commodity production. But once this is accomplished, I think it actually includes, it doesn't really take us much further. And there's an analogy here to the metabolic rift concept. I think the concept is really productive because it names a problematique of the environmental dimensions, contradictions, dynamics of capitalism. But as Mindy, Phil, others in the room have argued, and Jason Moore as well, it also starts to become a blockage if it's treated as a theory, which one might argue. I would agree with Jason and others who have argued, becomes a theory in John Bellamy Foster and other approaches, and as such, it may actually be limiting our ability to really analyze the dialectics and the contradictions and the fluidity and the dynamism of the process. I pose the same question about frontier. In other words, I really appreciate that it names the problematique, but once we've done that, maybe we need other categories through which to blast it forward. What does the notion offer in theoretical and methodological terms beyond the specific injunction to look at primary commodity production as constitutive of capitalism, which again, I agree with, but like, what's the next step? And maybe I'll just stop with one other point, because I've already gone way over my time. I have a few other points, but the one other one, which in a certain way is really the main spin-off of everything I've said so far, and this is probably not surprising given what I've said. What would it look like to really spatialize the concept of frontiers? Jason Moore covered this at length in his brilliant presentation back in the summer, and I'm really just echoing him here. Despite the deep historical knowledge and nimble command of evidence that our authors display in their paper, the Frontiers authors seem to use the concept of the countryside as a universal category. Even though they are certainly aware, not only of the widely variegated conditions in such non-city spaces, but of the dramatic creative destruction of their land use systems, their infrastructural equipment, their metabolic relays, their socio-political configurations over the 600-year period in question. I understand the reasons for this. Again, it's a way to open up a question, but I would urge our authors and others in the group to reinvent the categories in order to think space more dynamically. The point is not simply a question of theoretical taste. It's essential to the empirical terms of the inquiry. Start with any primary commodity, cotton, soybeans, oil. We're dealing not only with the locational conditions for its production across the earth. Once we open up the puzzle, as our authors do, of capitalization, of industrialization, we're dealing with infrastructuralization, the production of space, at various scales as a precondition and medium of surplus value extraction, circulation, and realization, and the combined and uneven metabolic dynamics of those processes. We need to spatialize, in effect, what Jason Moore describes as the nexus of appropriation and capitalization. The relation between the hidden abodes of industrial development and all of the preconditions of unpaid work and energy, both in terms of what Maria Mies classically called women nature colonies, and also what Jason Moore, of course, describes as the unpaid work of nature, rather than just assume that all of the dynamics associated with those processes simply fit into a preconceived category of the countryside. Equally, through the recurrent crisis tendencies and forward motion of capital, we are dealing, I would argue, with the dramatic creative destruction of those hidden abodes and the infrastructural configurations that facilitate the appropriation capitalization nexus. The constant search for new spatial arrangements through which to manage those crisis tendencies, whether within or among specific circuits of primary commodity production in relationship to ongoing processes of city building and more. And just a last point, and I promise I'll stop. The authors obviously engage with a lot of different literatures that are relevant to that. And they also engage at a couple moments with David Harvey's work. And not that David Harvey has the answers. David Harvey doesn't have the answers, but he certainly has some categories that I would argue are useful. And there's a moment in the paper, which I was a little surprised by, where the authors suggest that Harvey's concept of the spatial fix is monocausal in the same way neoclassical economics is. And this could be a conversation over a beer someday, but I would just flag that aside from how we read David Harvey's work, I would beg to differ. A lot of the work that I've done on urbanization over the years has involved precisely trying to historicize, spatialize, and the concept of the spatial fix and articulate it to different institutional and, in more recent years, environmental configurations of capital. It's actually a pretty nimble concept that provides a way in. It's not the only way into the question of combined and uneven development in relation to precisely the kinds of concerns that our authors have. So more generally, there's a rich literature in radical geography, which I know people are very familiar with here in the room, which could advance that project. Whereas the notion of the frontier, again, seems more universalizing. And to the degree we keep using it, it might actually prevent us from confronting that challenge as explicitly as we need to. So in conclusion, what I'm suggesting here as a research imperative or possibility is that it's basically the dialectics of space or spatialization all the way down. We have to invent our units and categories of analysis in and through the process of historical inquiry. Again, Phil McMichael, Incorporated Comparison, 1990. And doing that would actually require further development of spatial vocabularies, not only for looking at urban questions and urbanization processes the way I do, but in many ways, the same imperatives apply to the study of primary commodity production. Apologies for going over my time limit, but hopefully that's provocative, and I look forward to hearing from Phil and Nancy into our conversation. Thank you all very much.
Thanks a lot, Neil. That was excellent. Great. Well, let's go over now to Philip McMichael. I'll pass the word to Phil.
Thanks, Hannah. Nice to see you again. And Eric, last time I saw you, I was pretending to be Emmanuel Wallerstein.
I remember that.
Okay. So I'd like to thank the four authors for a very ambitious and hopefully path-breaking project on interdisciplinarity, and it's quite fascinating. I've got a few comments or questions on turns of phrase or claims from the authors' reply to their interlocutors as they suggest the tasks ahead. And then secondly, I want to bring up a couple of methodological issues. I'm actually still trying to take in all of Neil's comments. I'll come back to that later. So the history of the making of the modern world, I really like the way in which you're putting that, because the historians who responded, or those who represented history, wanted to talk about, say, a global history or a history of the countryside. And I think the kind of things that Neil mentioned made a lot of sense here critically. And it just seems to me that you need to have an analytical purpose, and the making of the modern world is obviously the beginning, but it has to do with the expansion of capitalism, but also the historicization of the countryside compared with conventional empirical history. One of the big questions I have is, how does this gain perspective? This is a quote. How does this gain perspective on contemporary dilemmas? Moving on, to understand the crises or fixes leading to the current situation, the authors say we need to go back to the beginnings of global capitalism. Again, what does this mean? Perhaps we need to reformulate with the present as embodying history. And I think that's clearly implicit, if not explicit, in the proposal. For example, the assault on rural life worlds and materials via progressive enclosure and erasure of those life worlds. And secondly, the temporality of fossil fuel conversion inviting socio-ecological collapse, which of course is one of the big present concerns. On the issue of commodity frontiers, I like the way in which you use the concept of fringes, which are not just places, but relational processes. And I would add to what Neil was getting at, that I think blockchains could be well understood as frontiers. They represent not just a spatial fixed place, so to speak, but a way in which capitalism is expanding its reach, to put it very quickly. I think you probably know what I mean. And I think that the idea of these frontiers are appropriate units of analysis as lenses on commodity regime formation. But question, how to establish, quote, the unity of the diverse, unquote, and, quote, patterning, unquote, to constitute commodity regimes. That's a bigger issue, and I'll leave that just there as a question. I see the commodity regimes as cycles of expansion, resistance, and fixes to overcome limits as the key to understanding the present. Again, the question is, how does this work? So each fix in turn overcomes limits to further expansion. So if we're thinking about a current fix, how would we group, for example, such disparate fixes as, firstly, state-organized agronomic research in Brazil to recolonize the Cerrado for the soybean frontier. Secondly, private equity firms competing for Congolese cobalt in this so-called green capitalism moment. And thirdly, China's Belt and Road Initiative as public infrastructural network embedded in landscapes and states, compared with footloose neoliberal investment forms. And finally, the last question is, what are the dimensions of regime power across time? I think this is not spelt out sufficiently. And I mean here both temporal and spatial dimensions of regime power. That is, how to prioritize political and/or economic coordinates, such as empires, states, the military, certain property relations, the imperialism of free trade in the 19th century with Britain, haute finance in the City of London, foreign aid, value chains, foreclosure of the future via commodification and its ontological power, depicting inevitabilism, leading to the dispossession of life worlds and erasure of local practices. So those are just a few questions that I'm raising there. Now I want to move on to some specific methodological issues as food for thought, so to speak. And here, Berg, one of the commentators, makes the comment that the proposal tends to conflate the commodity frontier with rural societies. And I think this raises two key related methodological issues. Firstly, the local global dialectic, and secondly, ontological encounter. So firstly, this proposal aims to avoid a fetishism of commodity frontiers, which is commendable. This suggests a method of local global dialectics, which we might understand as a double movement inherent in processes of commodification. Singh's concept of friction is appropriate here in the author's specification of ecological relations, resource competition, and social resistance, playing out as localized processes. These shape the conditioning of commodity frontiers, particularizing global process and registering alternative practices that are unthinkable within a universal market episteme. This could be exemplified in Hannah Whitman's research, for example, on Brazilian landless workers' struggles to realize what she calls agrarian citizenship. In other words, revaluing small landholders as food and environmental stewards in an urban-based market culture premised on expanding commodity frontiers via marginalization of those smallholders. Such struggles compare not in relation to one another, but as multivalent responses in a shared global political economic conjuncture, the commodity regime. To understand how commodity regimes are accomplished, it's important to understand how local subjects receive, legitimize, and/or contest commodification. Amalia Leguizamon's Seeds of Power, came out last year, on the Argentinian soy frontier, is an exemplar of this, where she's looking at how the pampas are farmed from a distance with the aid of satellites and high-tech instruments by professionals and entrepreneurs who farm from the comfort of urban settings and IT offices, representing the transcendence of the urban-rural divide by modernization of the countryside. Meanwhile, she goes on, mothers mobilize around child health risks from agrochemicals. Quote, "These women bring to the table a way of knowing risk that is different from modern corporate-sponsored science, gathering data constantly on their children for their mobilization." At issue here is revealing local human and ecological damage of commodification for redress. And it is the work of international agrarian movements these days to consolidate such rights violations for global attention, described, for example, by Ingeborg Gard in her book, Peasants Negotiating a Global Policy Space, La Via Campesina and the Committee on World Food Security. Such actions express worldwide struggles against violent commodity frontiers and/or so-called green capitalist frontiers. as a global containment strategy with respect to time as well as politics. Here, Naomi Klein's concept of disaster capitalism and the shock doctrine explicitly focuses on corporate mobilization to undercut active counter movements via complicit states and now their collective institution, the United Nations, which we saw in September in the Food Systems Summit, where the WEF, the World Economic Forum, representing the biggest transnational corporations in the world, made a deal with the United Nations to hold this Food Systems Summit, convened by the President of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, and so forth. So it seemed to me that this was a very good example of how the shock doctrine is now working at the global, the international level, the United Nations being colonized essentially by the corporate sector to become the global governing body for food. So here the local global dialectic works both ways. Current mobilization includes state-sanctioned alliances between finance, digital firms and agribusiness, covering their tracks with precision agricultures to claim greening, as well as the power to manage commodity frontiers. So 3 final comments here on the author's strategy of frictions. Firstly, the local global dialectic. The local shows the face of the global in response to commodification. Here, the movement for food sovereignty is instructive as a politicized claim reflecting and unmasking the corporate fix via liberalization of global food trade and investment at the expense of territorial food systems and cultures. A most recent manifestation in India's farmer uprising with broad social alliances versus Prime Minister Modi's attempt to open up new commodity frontiers, a new commodity frontier to corporate agro-export investment. And of course, more recently, worldwide resistance to the Food Systems Summit, which was phenomenal. I mean, it was just amazing how all of these different groups across the world, not just agrarians, but also urbanites concerned with food systems, etc. Secondly, decentering knowledge and alternative possibilities. And here, a very good example, and I'll talk about this, is representization, Jandal van der Ploeg's concept. And thirdly, the ecological consequences of long-term metabolic rift. So moving on now to my concept of ontological encounter, which Neil may recognize from 2010 in a paper I delivered at a conference he organized on the comparative imperative. My paper went over like a lead balloon because I don't think people were ready for this kind of use of incorporated comparison. So here goes. Hopefully you guys are ready. So as above, the encounter by commodification generates pushback. This is analogous to Martinez-Alia's point that indigenous peoples of necessity adopt the modern language of environmentalism to protect their landscapes and life worlds, even as natural reproduction is culturally inherent. This is partly opportunistic, as local ways are not commensurate with modernist ontology. But there's no need to stop here, since the local global dialectic is interactive. An additional resolution to this is to deploy incorporated comparison to understand such ontological encounters as mutually conditioning across time and space. As we know, conventional comparison typically occurs within and indeed constitutes a singular ontology comprised of universals devoid of ecological relations. Its object of inquiry may be historical transition, but organized by categories given in the present, reproducing a self-referential ontology, necessarily erasing alternatives. Hugh Campbell's recent book, Farming Inside Invisible Worlds, confronts the consequences of how to conceptualize alternatives to what he calls ecological chaos in New Zealand's contemporary farming sector. Today, we're experiencing ecological consequences, and while political economy and ecology are epistemically distinctive, they condition one another in a self-forming contradictory conjuncture. For analytical purposes, I represent this as an ontological encounter between two logics, the market and the ecological logic. As Martinez-Alia puts it, two languages of valuation. In his recent book, Dark Emu, Black Seeds, Agriculture or Accident, Bruce Pascoe recovers from colonial settler erasure the sophistication of Australian Aboriginal civilization based in landscape and soil management, underlining the ecological logic of so-called prehistoric people. Quote, Aboriginal people are born of the earth and individuals within the clan had responsibilities for particular streams, grasslands, trees, crops, animals, and even seasons. The life of the clan was devoted to continuance. In contrast, the market logic is devoted to discontinuance. For example, all the shrimp you can eat involves the destruction of mangrove ecologies and human livelihoods. So a market logic is also one-dimensional, reducing value to price and rationalizing space-time relations, mediated by property. It erases the co-production of humans and nature as suggested by Peruvian Indian Justo Oxa. Quote, the community, the Ailu, is not only a territory where a group of people live, it's more than that. It's a dynamic space where the whole community of beings that exist in the world lives. This includes humans, plants, animals, the mountains, rivers, and the rain, etc. All are related like a family. It's important to remember that this place is not where we are from, it is who we are. Such ontological encounter is necessarily historical with variable outcomes, such as long-term environmental devastation, climate emergency, short-term agricultural or mining bounty, profit and power, climate-smart agriculture and its contradictions, emancipatory possibilities, repeasantization, and so on. And such ontological encounter is, of course, asymmetrical, while ecological practices replenish, market practices undermine. Here, from Martinez Elia, circulation time trumps, sorry to use that word, but trumps biological time. Van der Ploeg quotes a quote, peasant-like ways of farming often exist as practices without theoretical representation. Hence, they cannot be properly understood, which fuels the conclusion that they do not exist or are at best some irrelevant anomaly, unquote. Nevertheless, I think they represent emancipatory responses to build ecological wealth, even if farm households intersect with market logics via off-farm work, agritourism, nature management, etc. Such combinations of logics help to define countrysides. For example, Hannah Whitman and Jennifer Blesch have been examining how MST camps embrace emancipatory responses to the extent that they're able to complement or replace the market logic with their agroecological practices. And this has been initially aided by Lula's Zero Hunger campaign, with the state providing the market outlet to distribute MST staple foods to the Brazilian poor. So, in conclusion, for incorporated comparison purposes, incorporated comparison purposes, such logics are more than ideal types, since they are historically produced or enacted, and therefore comparable as mutually conditioning ontologies defining particular conjunctural relations. Their interdependencies express world ordering and might be of assistance to this commodity regimes project methodologically in providing a more complex understanding of the overlapping tensions and possibilities in each historical conjuncture. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Philip, that was wonderful. So yeah, let's now go to Nancy for her comments and views. Nancy, you have the floor.
Okay, first, thank you so much for this opportunity. I really enjoyed reading the paper that we're commenting on today and the other papers associated with it in the Journal of Global History. I'm supposed to have only 10 minutes, but so I'm going to get right to it. I want to make 4 points where I think a bit more work is needed, recognizing that the task that this group has set for itself is really, really hard and also really important. I agree with much of what has already been said by Neil and Phil, and there may be a little bit of overlap in what I have to say, but I'm going to try to give a couple of examples that are somewhat beyond where they went. So let me just foreshadow what I'm going to say a little bit. I took to heart the initial comments in the paper that the authors chose the term commodity regimes in order to get away from a too economically driven analysis of capitalism's history through this particular window. I don't think that the model is quite there yet. In some ways, the group has its work cut out for it. But my comments today are not really meant as some kind of hard-hitting critique to which I have the answers, but as a set of questions through which I wonder if such massive goals as describing a history of capitalism solely in global terms is in fact really possible. So on to my 4 points. First, a global commodity regime's history based on transitions through crisis must take an expanded conception of capitalism, acknowledging as part of its very core the non-economic conditions that are essential to the maintenance of this capitalist economy. Now, Nancy Fraser's article is from 2014 is cited in this piece. I'm going to be making a fair amount of use of her work to talk about my comments today. As she said eloquently, beautifully, these kinds of conditions include both the natural processes that sustain life and provide the material inputs for social provisioning, and the solidary relations and effective dispositions that furnish the appropriately socialized and skilled human beings who constitute labor. Nancy's work, of course, is cited in that article as a means of expanding the scope of the commodity chain to include the unwaged household work and the free gifts of nature. But her contribution and call to arms, I think, goes far beyond that to the very structures of everyday life, to care or effective economies, to the broader realm of social reproduction, all things that she sees as behind even the hidden abodes of production that others mention and work through in their related articles and books on this topic. So the paper's authors claim that the concept of commodity regimes is, quote, a medical historical device, a meta-historical device that allows us to capture the ways in which different societal domains in commodity frontiers, ecological, technological, social, and political, are organized and relate to one another. It allows us to periodize and subdivide as needed while still understanding the unity of the diverse, unquote. It's a beautiful quote. I would love to hear more on this because so much of it is actually left out of the conceptualization of each period, I think. Where are the social relations? I kept wondering to myself as I read. The article focuses further on the economic aspects of each regime, constituted by what are largely economic factors, labor systems, property regimes, technologies, and the kinds of state interventions that are made around land and resource control. Now, some of these might be considered to be part of the more social forces of reproduction, as Stefania Barca says in a recent piece that she's written. But I don't think that they're represented as much in this particular paper. And it's not unusual. Many existing crisis models tend to focus over much on the economic aspects of these periods. They're isolated from and always supersede other factors, according to Fraser. And even the attempt at including more of the social domain in this article is simply put under the category of resistance. And I think Phil has laid out a few examples of how the authors might go beyond this by drawing on others' works. Fraser also more productively calls this category of resistance perhaps as struggles over nature, social reproduction, and public power, implicating multiple axes of inequality, including nationality, race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, and class. These conflicts, of course, are sites of tension that are far more than resistance, all with their long, localized, and intersectional socio-environmental histories. Now, related to this point is another more thorny one that scholars working at other scales will recognize. Given the limits on the social that are already in this model, I wonder how a history of global commodity regimes can address more complex and ubiquitously demanded questions of social difference that are the stuff of local agency that the authors clearly want to include, but which manifest so many different ways on the ground. The regime approach is a step closer to a nuanced explanation, but can it really be global? And does it really emanate from the countryside, or are the struggles just taking place there with the countryside as a kind of backdrop? My second point concerns not just the inclusion of ecological, geological, or environmental factors, but again, centers on this question of difference, this time environmental differences. The question of environments and ecologies has been dealt with extensively in the paper, again, in a way that draws largely on the economic lessons learned from political economists, ecological economists, macro-oriented geographers, and sociologists. That said, it remains a mystery as to how we can mobilize global-scale research that takes seriously the profound differences that abound in different environments and socio-natures, particularly cause and effect sorts of questions concerning the materialities of the commodities and frontiers in particular regimes. Again, difference is relational here. The environment, ecologies, or geologies cannot remain a black box. And the differences in global environments across the different periodizations are not really rendered part of the regime's temporal demarcations. For example, the degree to which the global environment has been simplified in particular periods, and the carry through of what we might call some kind of cumulative effects from one period into another. Whether speaking of an environment that's only been minimally altered or thoroughly destroyed or transformed, the particular combination of its components that individually and together also shift over time have to be understood as different from one site or moment of crisis, and as well as the incremental changes that occur within to the next. I don't really have time for examples here, but thinking holistically about these differences, I think is really important if part of the team's goal is to address some of the larger problems of the present through creating understandings of prior commodity frontiers and regimes' long-term effects on the present. For example, even though I don't have time, the materialities of resources were a major part of Stephen Bunker's generative book, which is mentioned in the paper. The materialities of trees, however, as well as of tropical, temperate, and Arctic forests are very different from each other, as are the materialities of carrots and other field crops. Those materialities affect how technologies of extraction and marketing are enabled differently. For example, for gold, cobalt, groundwater, the ocean floor, etc., and how the technologies for attaining these have changed over time. They affect, and they're affected by transport technologies. I really do not need to give this group a list of examples, but it's very easy to imagine the huge ecological, geological, climatic, and contextual differences of these environments, and I'm wondering how the group sees them affecting commodity frontiers beyond the abodes of production and marketing. Third is that violence in the production of space and territories, which is pointed out in the short piece by Mostern, but in a kind of limited way, wherein commodity regimes are produced, is actually underplayed. She has a great quote in her piece. Any research about commodity frontiers concerns a literal and material geospatial world and the laws and guns that keep it fixed in space. That's absolutely correct. But the built-in violence of the commodity frontier, I think, is much more varied and more diverse in its forms than simply guns and military, and is also part of the broader commodity regime. And the aftermath of the initial brutal violence is the violence of formalization and simplification and reallocation of rights, as well as epistemic violence that takes varied forms in its different sociocultural contexts. Fourth, the forces in production and processes of social reproduction change over time and need to be addressed in this model as a changing set of things that appear in those hidden abodes. Again, this leads us to work by Fraser, by Silvia Federici, by Stefania Barca, even by Mike Davis and Phil and lots of other people to start with, all of whom have done revisionist theoretical work on Marx and Marxist thought and practice in various domains of social theory. These authors all demonstrate the origins of ideas that commodities cannot be produced without taking account of the natures of the social relations and of the care or values that are researched and understood separately or outside of studies of production in many cases. Again, I think the goal of the global historians here is to bring these together. And that means to look at production and reproduction as a means together, as a means of understanding the progression of capitalist society, as opposed to merely understanding the capitalist economies. Okay, but the titles of the regimes all invoke the economy. The early capitalist commodity regime, the corporate commodity regime, the industrial commodity regime, the neoliberal commodity regime. These are all economic terms, and except in the word regime, there's no real hint of social relations, changing forces of social reproduction, and no discussion of difference of any kind, whether social or environment. And of course, this is the huge difficulty of how and what to simplify in a project as big as this one is. But I think it's very, very important to bring this material in. So in conclusion, this expansion of the notion of the commodity regime beyond the economic is crucial. It's a great opportunity for global historians. The necessary details required to achieve some kind of a fusion usually get lost in the macro approaches, but they are suggested here and elsewhere in the issue of the hidden abodes. The social dimensions of capitalism itself, the defetishizing of production or extraction, and the reinsertion in some way of the more social dimensions of the relationships and practices on which production sits. We need to, these can be found in the combination of production and social reproduction. I think the article is a brilliant intervention in what is a challenging field of thought. It seems unfair to impose more demands on this, but I come back to the question of what is at stake: a history of commodities, a history of commodity frontiers, or a history of commodity regimes that will explain further the history of capitalism. If the authors were to write another version that takes account of all these conversations, I would suggest that the processes and hidden abodes that are discussed here and in others' remarks, including those that are in the journal, need to be added to the paper's conceptual mix, and then face down the difficulties of method and sources. Although the authors may not have intended this, the impression that the paper leaves is a decidedly economic one, rather than a more holistic and overarching social perspective. And it has the further effect of actually and unintentionally fetishizing commodity frontiers and regimes and dissociating them from the larger socio environments of which they are a part. How to open those containers of hidden social and environmental relations that are located in commodity frontiers and regimes, as well as in those Wallersteinian commodity chains that are mentioned in the paper. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Nancy, for your comments and the questions. We'll now take some time to get some replies from the authors themselves, because we want to make sure that everybody else on this in this event can also share their questions. We will try to keep that short, so we'll ask that Sven, Mindy, and Erik each pick out one point, because there's really a host of questions and a couple of very tough questions that we might not be able to probably respond to entirely today. So if you could just pick out one point that you want to comment on for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have some time also to listen to or to take up some other questions from the audience. So yeah, just type away your questions and comments in the chat as well. I'll first give the floor to Sven. Sven Dekker, please.
No, let Eric go first, okay? If you, Eric, would you mind?
Okay, if Eric doesn't mind, then I'll pass the floor to Eric.
I regard that as a honor, Sven. Thank you all for these challenging comments. And well, so many times I felt like yeah, being well, that you were able to point at elements that indeed in our project probably are underdeveloped. In other times I felt like that it depended, or it was the outcome on the way we try to formulate our research agenda in an article, and that we probably not always were able to clarify enough in what way we think the project should go. And I think the big challenge, and I see it in the different intervention, is that of course you have to find a kind of a language. You have to appropriate a language that has been produced in different stances of academic and scientific literature. You try to give it some meaning, and by building up a research project, you also challenge the concepts. And what I feel that you want us to do is not only. That's
our bike.
Oh.
My bike.
Fernand Brodel is showing up. What a wonder. Hi, Fernand. That this language is both the way to frame a project, but also is very restrictive, or is that it makes you very, very vulnerable. And we know that it's true with the concept of frontiers, it's true with the concept of regimes, and it's true, maybe I have to say something about it, with the concept of the countryside. We are aware that from the start you have to make some choices to understand, and Nancy asked us what is actually the final goal of your project. And I would say that the last of the three choices, it's a history of commodity regimes. It should address the most ambitious level, but these regimes, of course, are construction, as stressed by Phil, that should be discussed and should be rethought during the comparative research we are setting up. So the challenge is to be aware that the concepts you use have the danger of framing your research, as you suggested, Nancy, in a more economic way, which I think it isn't. We really discussed that a lot, and we really think that the lineup of case studies we are thinking about are much more holistic and than the purely economic approach. But the language, yeah, it's both. It's limiting and yeah. So it's the tension, it's the stress, it's the need to question yourself while aligning or while carving out a research project. So, well, that one example I would take the countryside, and that brings me to some remarks of Neil. For us, it was kind of a logic step to move the lens, and that's one of the elements that we use Commodity Frontier as a lens to understand how we can make sense of evolutions that have been described so many times from a bottom-up perspective. How can we move it from a top-down perspective to a bottom-up perspective? And then you have to make some choices, and then you have to use some categories. So how to understand something as a countryside in a very dynamic way that's not predefined, and that's not, well, that one way or another allows us to see how relationships work over the established concepts of economic behavior, of city-urban divides, of nature, non-nature divides, and so on and so forth. So I see what the three of you, what you mean, and there are many elements I noted down that I think, yeah, I think we have answers to that in the discussion we should have. But there are other ones that I think we really should take up, and that's the one of specialization, the space to make much more clear how we conceptualize it as a dynamic process, and how we use frontiers as a lens to understand these dynamic processes, and that include also so-called non-economic relationships and so on and so forth, all other ways of organizing ecology, nature, and on the other hand, how to bring in all these bottom-up perspectives in a framework where we can make them talk in a broader sense. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge. We can bring up so many case studies, and that's one of the starting points that we formulated. There exists so much material, and again, the three of you quoted many of these authors, but we feel the need that we should let them speak in a way to other authors that claim to understand the capitalism and world economy from a more economic top-down perspective, that we need to have this discussion, and that discussion is not only academically important, but also very important from the perspective of talking about the organization of our society today and tomorrow. And this debate, that dialogue, I think we should really think about what is the language we can use, what are the concepts we can use, what are the time-space frames we can use, that we can make our points, our arguments, so that we also can have that discussion with those people that actually are not interested in the language and in methodologies that are so popular in, let's say, the world of research that we are very close with. So it's an ambition that's both academically and non-academically, I think maybe too big for a small group as us, but we have to keep it open, and we have to also question or to ask ourselves how we can use these concepts, how we can use these insights, how we can translate them also in other fields of research so other people can participate. And then we need concepts as regimes, as frontiers, and so on and so forth. But in a way, yes, and I stop here in a way that we can make clear that we use them in a holistic, dialectical, in let's say historical, in an historical manner. And that's, it's my unstructured and very first reaction I can give here. I'm sorry for this confusing thoughts, but well, because of these very rich comments, I don't think I was able to give a more focused one. Thank you, Hanne.
Great, thank you, Erik. I'll now move to Mindy for her.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all three of you for these really super, well, first the really rich reading of the articles and also the comments, and then also your questions that you raised for us. Yeah, it's a bit overwhelming, I have to say, because we didn't see your comments ahead of time, of course. So we've just been sitting and trying to listen and now trying to formulate a response on the fly. I'll do my best. And I think the place to start is really to pick up a couple of you raised, but Neil, especially, you ask, what is a frontier? And sort of warn of this danger of when concepts slip into being used as theories. And I really agree with that. And I've been thinking quite a lot about, the conceptualization that I think still needs to be done a bit in our project on the commodity frontier, on the frontier itself and even on production. I think what Nancy raises very much with the idea of social production and how we're looking at the abodes and the hidden abodes. And I think it's important, well, I guess I'll say, I think part of the challenge, but also the promise that we have in a group like this is we're so interdisciplinary. I mean, the three of us, there's 3 historians and I'm a sociologist, and then our network is including people from, you know, many other disciplines and sectors. And so that is a challenge to try to find this language that Eric was talking about and try to find the places where we all can kind of, you know, speak to each other and understand each other. And with that said, I do think we need more conceptual work. I think, for instance, about this concept of the frontier in and of itself, and have come to realize increasingly that it can be a really traumatic word for many people. This notion of the frontier and the way that it's been used and the violence associated with frontier expansion and the way that it's been used in sort of this neutral way as if it's just a description and not an absolutely violent relationship. That's really I've become more conscious of that and want to think a lot more about it. We have a Indigenous scholar who's in our network, Andrew Curley, who he asks us to define the commodity frontier as literal sites of struggle. He sort of wants to reject this idea of metaphors and concepts and say, no, these are literal sites where, you know, there's this contestation, there's violence, there's appropriation, but there's also all of these life worlds and forms of living and making food and everything that are not appropriated. So I'm really just grateful for your comments on that to help think further about what this conceptualization of the frontier and the commodity frontier might look like. Yeah, I also think to think methodologically, to pick up on some of what Phil has shared about the idea of regimes and the way we're trying to propose this kind of method where we're looking at these regimes, let's say, as relatively stable periods with these moments or periods of contestation in between that lead to some sort of bigger shift. You know, it's something that we're thinking about and trying to test out more than stating that this is how it's been. I think a lot in our paper are really open questions more than arguments that we've already settled on, as much as, let's say, boxes that we think we need to open, and thinking about how, you know, in this moment where we've sort of really tentatively said maybe something new is going on, maybe a new regime might be coming together. It's really too soon to tell, of course. And Phil, you point out all of these different relationships between states and private corporations and blockchain, for instance. So I would really say in this moment, probably if we're in anything, it's a period of transition, maybe, you know, if this regime framework makes sense, that there's a lot to watch and a lot that's changing. And again, Nancy, if we bring in this, looking at it through the lens of social reproduction, I think we get perhaps, I don't want to say an entirely different state, but we get a much different story. So yeah, I think I also want to emphasize the open questioning nature of what we're doing. While of course we have strong ideas and arguments, I don't mean that. We have a lot of questions that we want to ask. And what I see, one of the things I'll just say that personally that I appreciate the most about our group and this initiative and network is that I see the commodity frontier concept and ideas really, it's broad enough for a lot of people. It's a kind of a big umbrella that a lot of people and ideas can sort of fit in. And we kind of want to take these debates under the umbrella, right? So rather than being dogmatic and exclusionary, I think part of what we're trying to do is engage in these debates and questions. And I find that really generative, and conversations like this really help me think more about what we've already proposed. So just again to offer thank you for your comments.
Great, really, thanks a lot. We'll now listen to Sven Becker for a last short reply by the authors before moving to the audience. Sven.
Okay, thank you so much, Hanne, and thank you so much to all of you for your brilliant comments, which I agree with Eric. are somewhat overwhelming, and it's not easy to engage them in spontaneously, which is why I allowed Eric to speak first, because I didn't really know exactly how to respond. But maybe a couple of things. Look, I didn't find myself fundamentally disagreeing with what was said, and I think there are a lot of really interesting ideas of how we can broaden our concepts and how we can think about aspects of that history that we haven't fully thought out in this paper. But maybe we should step back a little bit and just remind ourselves how we got to this particular project. And I think we came to that project partly because we were all engaged in rethinking capitalism. Not everything we were thinking of was necessarily never thought of before or totally original. But we had a certain way of being unhappy with how capitalism has often been conceptualized that brought us to this project. And one of them was, of course, that so much of the history of capitalism has been understood from a national perspective. And we decisively believe that capitalism can only be understood from a global perspective. Then we also noticed that so much of capitalism has been understood primarily from the perspective of cities and of industry. And we all agreed that capitalism needs to be also understood from the perspective of the countryside and from agriculture. And then we observed that many people were working on the histories of all kinds of commodities, but we felt that the research that accumulated in that field didn't really add up to a fully articulated understanding of the bigger problem, namely the long history of capitalism and the role of the countryside within it. So this is perhaps how we were, this is perhaps a good reminder how we got started on this project. And I think it's also important to remind ourselves that the paper that we published was not the kind of summary of the research findings of a project that had gone on for a long time, but it's really just for us a way to grapple with the issue of how such a project could be envisioned and how it could be structured. And that is how we came to this particular project. I agree with Mindy that the idea was to create a way of thinking about this problem that provides a big umbrella that allows people expert in various parts of the world and very different parts of history, and also coming from very different disciplines to engage with these kinds of questions, which I think we succeeded in. The project has drawn a lot of commentary and a lot of engagement from people working in many different parts of the world on many different problems in many different time periods and on many different regions from many different disciplinary perspectives. And I think in so far that has been a success. If it comes across as being too focus on economics, yeah, maybe there's some truth to that. I mean, certainly we very much agree with that we need to focus on capitalist society and not just the capitalist economy. In some ways, part of our motive of looking at the global from a local perspective is exactly that we believe that it allows us to capture these important social relations in understanding the changing character of capitalism. But perhaps because in our practical work, we encountered often, we had, let's put it like that, we had difficult conversations with many economists. And perhaps because we wanted to somehow address their concerns, or because we hoped that we somehow would be able to bring them on board, which we didn't really succeed in. But maybe that's why we shifted a little bit too far to the side of the question of capitalist economy and took not enough care to think about issues of capitalist society. So I appreciate that comment. I think that is very useful. I also agree very much with what Neil said about looking at different forms of spatialization. That clearly is very easily accommodated within this project, and I think that is a really important factor. I also agree with you, Neil, that the commodity frontier is it's not a theory, but it's a problem, and it's a problem, and a problem that we believe is really quite fundamental to tackle this problem. Is quite fundamental to tackle the bigger issue of namely the what capitalism is and how it unfolded historically. I agree with the issue of violence, that this is important in the story of commodity frontier making. I think we aim to emphasize that, but maybe we don't do it sufficiently. And last but not least, I also agree that the notion of resistance, I was never that happy with how we deployed that concept. And I agree with that critique. I don't think that makes much sense, because the notion of resistance kind of sets, assumes that there is one, there's kind of one logic that unfolds, and then there is some resistance against that logic. But I think historically how capitalism has unfolded is exactly as a contested project, and the particular articulations of this capitalism, including the particular articulations that it finds at particular commodity frontiers, is an outcome of this contestation, and therefore that cannot be understood as, on the one hand, there's kind of an iron logic, and on the other hand, there are people who resist that logic. So again, this is very helpful, and I really appreciate that you're so deeply engaged with our work. Thank you.
Great, Sven. Thanks a lot. I've been keeping an eye on the chat. So far, we've had one question which has been addressed already by Erik, but I don't know. I'll repeat the question so that everybody can follow up and maybe ask whether Erik wants to add or elaborate a bit on his answer, or whether Ulbe.
Yeah, very, very briefly. I think the point was maybe, Santiago, that apparently we seem to dismiss the importance of archival work, and of course we don't, but we want to stress, and again, we are talking about multiple frictions, we're talking about multiple resistance, multiple encounters, multiple locations, and multiple dynamics of that. And we also say much work has already been done, but we do not use the work that has been done properly. So that's for us a research priority in this agenda. So there's two things. Apart from doing new archival work, it's also we consider this a big problem that the local experiences seem to be not only to be fragmented, although they are not fragmented, I think, in reality, but they are fragmentedly represented, whereas the global perspective is presented unified. So there we have another, to speak with Phil, a kind of ontological asymmetry. So we need to bridge that. We need to do something about that. And one of the things we said we could do was try to use the opportunities of the digital humanities to come up with both a more dynamic, a more holistic, the modern digital humanities allow for that, and a more unified perspective. So this is the real big challenge, I think, that we are facing in this research agenda. And I would say we have just mentioned this challenge. We have not yet, not even elaborated on this, how this challenge looks like. But this is what the point we're hinting at. If I may, Hanne, just to add one point of myself, listening to the comments, I think that what we did in this whole discussions we had over the past years, the newest concept of idea, in my view, that came up was the word friction. And perhaps that's the most interesting one. It might be a more interesting one than the commodity frontier or the fix. I think the friction is something which we need to unpack and to work on, because this allows us to take many things on board: spatiality, the social reproduction, the diversity. Friction is not a singular thing; it's multiple. It's in many places of the world. So I think that's something which we have not yet unpacked, and it might be interesting to do a lot more work on this particular concept. What we did, however, decide was that the frictions are the prime mover of the whole history of the regime. So we said we start each regime with a friction. You start with the fix, but we start with friction. That's and then we get the whole dialectics that emerge from that. So that would be my contribution.
So, but yeah, Nancy just posed a very brief question on the use of the concept of friction, whether you are referring to Anna Singh's book or her concept of friction.
No, I don't think so, but we should do so. This is my answer to Nancy. Friction, I refer to Anna Singh's book. No, we haven't.
Okay.
But
No, I'm just curious.
Part of the work that's still ahead of us. Yeah, one of the tasks ahead of us.
Yeah, and just to kind of throw in, if I may, yeah, it's not the be all end all of uses of the word friction, but and a little bit on the under theorized side. So I was just curious if that was one of the things you were referring to.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Meanwhile, we got another question by Ernst Langthaler. He asks, how do you, so Erik, Mindy, Sven, and Ulbe, the authors and coordinators of the network, how do you bring together the concept of commodity regimes that emphasizes rather global and structural aspects with more local and actor-centered approaches? So I don't know if one of the authors would like to reply to this question. Who would like to take this one up?
Well, just answering to Ernst, actually this is at the heart of the whole project, of course, and as I feel it from the start, when we started the discussion of this, yes, how to take up this challenge, we felt that we are playing, actually, we are moving on two levels, and the one level of these bottom-up localized research with all these questions about social relations, human nature relations. Of course, this is we did not invent this. We just want to become part of a rich tradition that has a long history, and it would be, well, the easiest would be just to contribute to this wide literature by adding new research, new perspectives from this bottom-up localized perspective, and that's also something I did in my research. Now, that second level, trying to open up a dialogue about the nature of how capitalism as a world system, to use a Palestinian concept, because that's of course the basic point. If you agree or not, is there a system working outside that has some systemic elements that you cannot understand just from a localized bottom-up perspective. So bringing them together, of course, is a big challenge. And again, that is not new. Actually, we are not original on no one of these levels, but the taking up the challenge, we think that one way or another that this challenge has been discussed a lot, but underdeveloped still. Well, we did not find a real good entry point to bring together these insights that have been built up in the rich tradition of all these kind of beautiful studies from a very localized perspective, and then these strong statements that have been made from scholars working from the more structural macro perspective, and it's a challenge. Yeah, how will we do that? That's the whole discussion that we want to start, and that's what we wanted to address in this paper. And please join the discussion. Yeah, I see Phil in my screen. Maybe you want to add something to that.
Yes, I don't know, Phil, if you want to add to that question, or we have a new question also coming up. So.
No, I would just echo what Erik was saying. I mean, I see many people in my screen, so anybody else is happy to join in.
Great.
Thanks for being on me, Erik.
We have a question coming in from Andrew Edwards, and he's asking how do the authors conceptualize the non-commodity? So are commodity frontiers the leading edge of spatialized capitalist production, or is it a frontier or multiple frontiers between different ways of conceptualizing the world? So any of the authors who's wanting to take up this question about the non-commodity?
I can offer just a quick response. I think the answer to this question is deeply tied up with the answer to how we conceptualize the frontier, of course. And I mean, I don't know, we don't have this strict sort of division between, let's say, the, you know, the political economy approach and the diverse economies approach, where we're trying to, you know, strictly define where capitalism or commodification begins and ends. But I think we're more, just to say, again, this is tied up with how we think about frontiers and commodity frontiers and the kinds of transformations and the kinds of social relations that we're trying to look at. So I guess this is sort of not answering the question at all, but I don't think about it as commodities and not commodities. I think of these as relational processes.
Great, thank you, Mindy. We haven't had new questions coming up, but I think as we're also not too huge group, if someone wants to intervene, maybe raise their hand, either someone, yeah, anyone on the Zoom, someone of the commentators, the authors. Oh, and I do see that we've
This is a new question from Santiago coming in.
Great, yeah. And so let's first move maybe to that. Oh, sorry,
yeah.
Ope.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll first maybe read out the question shared by Santiago Colmenares. In world economic history, globalization is usually framed in 3 time spans: 1850 to 1913, first globalization; deglobalization from 1913 to 1945, a second globalization from 1945 to 1970, and then a third globalization from 1970 to the present. Does this periodization of globalization has anything to say to the commodity regime's periodization? And my question, is there any of the authors who would like to address this question about periodization?
I would say that this periodization is very standard indeed in world economic thinking, or thinking in economic history, and it shows at the same time both the limitations of this way of thinking, looking to the world only from basically from trade figures. You can indeed start with this kind of periodization, but it lacks, I think, a deep historical understanding of the system where we are living in, which is much older than these timings starting in 1850. We use 1850 also, well, the second part of the 19th century, to understand how the world transforms from to another regime, but this regime perspective brings in many more elements than only world trade. So I think that by discussing periodization in one way or another and using regimes, it's a way to try to make sense of time. Well, is also taking up these debates with standard narratives about capitalism that have that most of the time limit the experience or human experience to some very basically economic processes, and limited in time, limited in space, and limited in human experience. So we don't use that framework. That's what I want to say.
Great, thanks. I believe Uwe also and Mindy as well want to react to that question. So first Uwe and then Mindy.
Yeah, because there's also a follow-up question by Nancy. What are those particular periodizations based upon? Why did we choose? We, of course, with the food regimes have also a slightly different periodization, and that ends, I think, in the 1930s, 1870s, 1930s, and then we have a periodization which is more or less also the periodization we adhere to. Why did we choose for 1850, 1970? Because it's a very important choice here. And then there's the last. I think it has to do, we discussed it extensively, with the changing role of the state. The maturing of the state bureaucracies, the way in which the state was also capable of organizing space with railroads, the territorial colonization. It was no longer the trading enclaves, but really the territorial colonization that took place. The role of the state in facilitating capitalist commodity frontiers in many places of the world, directly facilitated. It includes, of course, also the enclosures of land, so the legal structure that were underpinning colonial dispossession. And we felt that this role of the state is a kind of overarching moment in the history of capitalism, even though, of course, we very well recognize the severe frictions and contestations of the 1930s and the severe critique of capitalist commodity production in the 1930s, and even the birth of development economics in those days. But this choice is based upon what we perceived as a distinct role of the state in this particular period.
Great, thank you for that. I believe that also responds to Neil's comment/question about explaining the basis of the periodization that is being used by the research agenda. But maybe you also wanted to respond to this question.
Well, I just maybe will add a little bit of a face to, this formal printed word. To first say that we also propose these regimes and these periods also as questions based on, empirical understandings, of course, but I think we also propose them in a questioning kind of way. And we came to this notion of the regimes not at the beginning of the project, but when we all happened to be able to be together at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, we actually had time to sit with each other and talk, and in a way that you don't when you're not in the same place. And Wilba had given a presentation on his sugar project where he used this concept of the satellite. Probably I'm saying that wrong, but there was something about these waves, right? And we just sort of had a light bulb moment. At that time, our proposal looked very different and didn't have these regimes and didn't have this periodization in the same way. And so that was sort of what started us thinking about trying to use a periodization approach and look at the frictions and the fixes. And I'm sharing it because it was a nice moment and it's a place where the project really changed. And also just to say that I still see this as also a proposal more than a definitive statement. Maybe my colleagues disagree, but that's how I see it.
Okay, thanks, Mindy. In the meantime, we've got a question coming in by Spencer Tompkins, addressed to Professor Becker, to Sven Beckert, asking about when you mentioned that the Commodity Frontier Group was not successful in getting economists involved in this project. Why was this? And were there methodological boundaries that could not be bridged, or something else that played a role in this? So pass the floor to Sven.
That is an excellent question. And I don't know exactly how to respond to that, except to say that this is designed as an interdisciplinary project. It does deal with issues of economic change. It does deal with issues that economists have engaged with, though often or normally in very different ways from how we want to engage with it. And therefore, in the course of seeking funding for such a project, you will encounter economists who are being consulted as experts on these matters, if that is a project worth funding. And our experience has been that we have not been able to bring economists on board. And since economists enjoy an enormous degree of authority within academia, an enormous degree of authority towards funding agencies, that has been a major hurdle for us to be able to implement what we want to do. I think the disagreements between what it is we want to do and what it is that most, I'm not saying all economists, but what most economists do are just so great that it is almost impossible to bridge that gap. Even the very notion that there is such a thing as capitalism, and that there is not just like kind of one economic logic that has operated throughout human history, that is not always shared among all practitioners of economics. And therefore, even something that presumably everybody on this call takes for granted is often not easily communicated to economists. And this raises, of course, a much bigger issue, and this is probably also what partly motivates our project in the first place, is that we feel that that economists have too much authority to speak about the economy, and that we should claim some of these authority as historians, as sociologists, as anthropologists and others. And we want to also speak to larger audiences doing so. We don't just want to speak to our colleagues, but we want to speak to broader audiences. We want to speak to policymakers and others. And that has been very, very difficult. It is very difficult to claim the authority to speak about the economy in the past or in the present if you're not an economist. But I'm interested in what others think about this problem. We have not been able to figure out how to navigate that.
Great. Thank you, Sven, and yeah, thanks for raising that question about the economists. I did see while I was moving to that question that Neil Brenner did raise his hand, and then I just saw that too late. So maybe Neil, and then I see now Phil as well. So I'll move first to Neil and then to Phil too.
Thank you, Hanne. This takes us back to the periodization question. So Phil, if you want to go first, I can, if you're on this topic with economics, please feel free to go first, and I'll come in later. I'm not sure whether, maybe I should go ahead. Yeah, go for it. Go.
Thanks, Neil. By the way, I do have an economics degree from the University of Adelaide, so I'm the right person to talk about this, although that was 50 years ago or something. I was very struck with the issue of fixes as a form of periodization that the authors used, because it seemed to be a reasonable way of demarcating the periodic dimensions of the rise of capitalism. And the spatial fix, I think some people have raised questions about what that really means, but I think the order is spatial, technological, state, and corporate fixes. And I think it's a good set to work with. The other part of that is as I said, I like the frictions, because they also contribute to the idea of the fix, particularly the ecological, the resource competition, and social resistance. And they provide ways to pull together contradictions that are occurring within each phase, within each period between the fixes. So it seems to me to be an interesting way to capture the history of capitalism, but also to represent it in such a way that some economists might actually come on board. And I think, this is just off the top of my head, but there's obviously some kind of minor revolution going on in the economics discipline at the moment, with Mariana Mazzucato and the donut thing, Kate Rakow, Joseph Stiglitz. All of these people are beginning to recognize that, the kind of economics that I learned back in the 1960s is totally irrelevant now. And, that's very clear from what we've been talking about today. And so I think there's a way to capture some of those folks and bring them on board. And I don't know quite how to do that at the present time, but so that's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing was, Uwe mentioned the food regime periodization, and I think it was very different. What Harriet and I were doing was to, first of all, I mean, there were two elements that were important. One was the establishment of a world price for staple commodities like wheat and meat in the late 19th century. And the second part of it was the elaboration of a post-imperial nation state formation that was, I mean, Harriet picked up that idea from my dissertation on Australia, with the agrarian question being resolved politically by the emergence of an articulated, integrated national economy, manufacturing and agriculture. And that helped us to sort of put together a critique of the concept of development at the time, and to argue that one can use food provisioning on a world scale. That, of course, began when Britain offshored its agriculture back in the 1830s. It allowed us to, first of all, critique Wallerstein and argue that, in fact, the elements of the so-called capitalist world system were not constant. They were actually historical and changing. And secondly, that one could see periods of food regime as organized, firstly, through the imperial system for the first regime, and the second one, the nation state organization, which was an ideal. It wasn't a reality so much, because the United States, of course, and the Soviet Union used their particular empires to encourage consolidation, but by by using resources to help those states develop their internal economies, even as they were being colonized by foreign aid and foreign investment and so forth. And so that was the emergence of globalization, of course. And then I took the third regime, and I noticed that it's left very undeveloped, if you like, in the original article that you guys wrote, as if there's a possible signal that there's a third food regime. And I think that insofar as you use the corporate fix for your final period, I think obviously there's a correspondence there that not just agriculture and food, but also other resources are, subject to transnational corporate activity, and now private equity firms are getting in on the act, and it's becoming very complicated, of course, and I'm not quite sure where to go, although I think China is an important factor to take into account here, particularly in modeling the idea of public intervention or state intervention to manage territorial agrarian systems, and therefore to manage security, food security, as well as other kinds of security for citizens, albeit very repressive, obviously, in China. But it's going that way here too. So I don't know about the Netherlands, but anyway, so those are just some quick comments, and I really do like the resource competition idea. I think is fascinating, because we're seeing that, I don't know if you've been reading about the cobalt stuff in the Congo with Dikembe Mutombo, who was a great NBA basketballer, has now formed a private equity firm to get in on the act. And so these guys are all competing to claim that those mining pursuits. And meanwhile, China has a total lock on the processing of that stuff, not only cobalt, but also lithium. And, so I mean, I think those kinds of things are important to follow. And that's why I was trying to say, well, how do you characterize the present situation with what China's up to, the mining for green capitalism, and the other one where some of these commodity frontiers in South America are being actively organized by states, with agronomic research, which hadn't, I mean, Mindy's the expert on agronomy here. So, but anyway, so that's just some wild comments. Thank you.
Did you see the article on the hotel in Kinshasa where all these mining entrepreneurs are meeting nowadays?
Yes.
I thought this would be a great setting for a novel,
Exactly.
Yeah, I would like to, because we're going towards the very end of this event. There's just a couple of minutes left, but I would like to pass the floor still to Neil, maybe for a final comment. I did see that it might, if it's linked to, it's probably linked to periodization, and so the comments question by Nancy as well that also relates to this. So Neil, if you could maybe share your thoughts in the last minutes that we have on this event. Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, I have a lot to say on the question of periodization, and I'm just going to restrain myself also because I have a little person behind me who needs my attention. But the main thing is that we have a lot more to talk about with regard to periodization. I have more reflections on the matter. I really appreciated what Phil just said, and certainly food regime theory offers very specific criteria, which Phil just very concisely summarized for their particular periodization. But I'm not satisfied that, let me put it this way. I think I appreciate what Mindy said, that like this is a framework for opening up questions and research, and it's under development. So I fully appreciate and, you know, I'm on board with that. But in a certain way, the periodization that you all offer implies a level of theoretical clarity about your commitments that I don't think is fully fleshed out yet in the article. So it's kind of like if it's an emergent research program, then it could be premature to offer that periodization. But if you're going to offer that periodization, then one would need to flesh out in less descriptive terms, in more theoretically crisp terms, the basis for the particular choices. A lot more can be said about it. And let me also just in conclusion say that even though that sounded like a critical comment, I say that with full appreciation of the necessity to try to periodize and the challenges of doing so. Urban studies on this question is a disaster. And, you know, I'm working on that in relation to urban studies, and we have all kinds of periodizations in urban studies that just fully collapse as you sort of poke a little hole in them and they fully collapse, either into descriptivism or into theoretical positions that are completely untenable. So I say that as like I'm fighting my own battle in that regard. And I certainly don't have the solution, but I also, as I said a moment ago, I think we need to periodize as part of our research process. So there's no way not to, there's no way to do it. But anyway, hopefully we can have a more sustained conversation about that particular puzzle, which is everything. It's theoretical, it's political, it's very connected to questions of data. It's connected to questions about what are the units of analysis. So periodization is a certain way where it all comes together or not. So onwards. Thank you all very much.
Thanks a lot, Neil. And that was an excellent note to end on. Basically, an invitation to continue this conversation, which we will certainly do with the network. I just dropped a couple of links that you might find interesting in the chat. If you want to continue following up on this, what this network is all about, what it is doing, what we are planning to do in future months and years. There's some social media links where you can follow us, the website, of course, and there's a journal and also the project of the lexicon, a link to the article as well. So just do follow us, get in touch if you have any ideas of how to become involved or more challenging comments and questions for the network. That's very much appreciated. And I want to end by thanking, well, all of you who participated today, and especially our commentators, Nancy Peluso, Neil Brenner, and Phil McMichael, as well as the authors who took up some challenging questions today, Uwe Bosma, Mindy Schneider, Erik van Houten, and Sven Beckert. And I also want to thank the International Institute of Social History for facilitating this virtual space together. So I hope, to see all of you very soon. In
thanks for the moderator.
Yes, thank you, Hanne.